So here we go. We are still in Unit 15, and you're going to change the topic in your notes now to immigration, urbanization, and Gilded Age politics. So we're still in period six. We're still rebuilding the nation, 1850s to a little bit past the 1890s. Ready for this one? Another section in Unit 15. Let's start with the symbol for immigration and the welcome to America, the Statue of Liberty. So, the Statue of Liberty was actually given to America from France, and the guy who was hired to design it was Frederick Bartholdi, and it was completed in 1886. Then they had to figure out how to get it to America. It was shipped here in 350 pieces. It weighed tons and tons and tons and tons. And France said, we'll send you the statue, we'll pay for the shipping, but we're not going to build the base. And so President Grant was agreeable to build the base, which ended up costing more than the statue did. And of course, the government wasn't allowed to pay for it. He had to get a lot of private donations in order to build this base. And so, one of the number one families that donated to this statue was the Singer family. You may have heard this name before. They're super, super famous for Singer sewing machines. I think sometimes we forget that the Statue of Liberty was actually a French invention, and France, of course, doesn't forget it. There are six different Statue of Liberties all around Paris, and here's two of the most popular ones. One is right by the Eiffel Tower, so if you get on a boat, especially, and you go to see the Eiffel Tower, you're going to pass by their version of the Statue of Liberty. It's the same statue, it's just on a smaller scale. So we have the biggest of all of them, but it's the same statue. The most unique one is this piece of artwork. It's down in the section where a lot of the legal buildings are. Ugly, ugly, ugly statue, and I don't really understand the purpose behind it. But you see the circle on the guy's chest. That's actually a mini version of the Statue of Liberty that's peeking out of his chest. Don't ask me to explain it. I don't know the explanation. Weird, but there it is. So remember the Singer family? The section of the Singers that donated the most money is Catherine and Isaac Singer. And Catherine Singer ended up having an affair with Bartholdi. So the Statue of Liberty's face is actually the face of Catherine Singer of the Singer sewing machine family. You can see the likenesses here a lot. So you would think, oh my gosh, she's a harlot. No, really, you can't blame her for having an affair because Isaac, her husband, was a real swinger. He actually is going to end up divorcing Catherine after they have two kids, but he cheats on her the entire time. He marries multiple women. He has more than 10 children. They're still not sure how many kids he actually ended up having. At one point, he was married to more than one woman at a time. So just not a very socially acceptable kind of family. But that's where we get the face of the Statue of Liberty, Catherine Singer. All right, so let's look at the statue as it's coming together. So they brought the Statue of Liberty into the New York Harbor, and as they were preparing the base and figuring out how to put her together like a giant puzzle, remember it's 350 pieces, they had to leave portions of her all over the city. So it was kind of a unique thing to see. I would love to have been there back then and seen some of these oddities. So here's her head, of course. There's her torch. Isn't that cool? There's part of her feet, and the crown is being built there. And here we're putting the base together. So it was not a small, little, tiny process. It's going to take a decade to just assemble her, get the base ready. Big, big project. But make sure you do know that it was President Grant that said, we will build the base. Remember, he had the most corrupt administration, so least amount of money, and he had to go out and beg people to give him money, individual people, because the government couldn't. So it was kind of a mess. But we got her. Thank goodness we got her, right? And there they are starting to assemble her. You can see the crown of the torch there, finally assembled. And there she is being put together one more time. So just a fantastic thing to be able to see back then, I'm sure. So let's talk about how the immigrants checked into America. So on the west you have Angel Island, on the east you have Ellis Island. So Angel Island is going to be highly dominated by Asian people at Angel Island, and Ellis Island is going to be highly dominated by European people. So let's look at the difference in the building. So the Island building, for whatever reason, looks very official, kind of a government looking building, but look at the one at Ellis Island. Just gorgeous, gorgeous building. So I'm not really sure why they ended up making Ellis Island so beautiful, but it definitely is a gorgeous place you should go if you ever get a chance. So whether you come in on the west or the east, you got here on a boat. And most of these people that come here to America are coming because bad things are happening at home. It usually has something to do with money. And so these people do not have a lot of money. They're not going to be able to rent a cabin on a ship to get here. So instead, they rent a space. They might get a little room, maybe if they're lucky, but more often it's a space in the bows of the ship called steerage. So you were not allowed to come up out of steerage except in very tiny designated areas and during certain times of the day, because these ships mostly were like luxury liner type of things, but they would make extra money by allowing these poor people to rent space in steerage. So if you've ever seen the movie Titanic, when they realized the ship was going to go down, the ship officials were ordered to go and lock the steerage gates and lock all those people in the bows of the boat. So it was designed that you could lock them up if you wanted to. So steerage, not a good place. It was smelly. You had the worst food that there was, but it was a cheap way to get to America. And here's one of the common situations of living in steerage. So see, there's no rooms. You just had a space, and not even really a designated space. You were just allowed to go to steerage. So some boats, like I said, occasionally you would have a teeny tiny little room that had tons of beds in it, but more often it was just like this. You just lived in the bows of the boat. So let's talk about the Ellis Island experience. Angel Island isn't going to be very complicated. Either you got in or you didn't, end of story. But Ellis Island became this very complicated process to get you into America or to send you home. The very first thing that you did, that beautiful building that I showed you, has a giant staircase in it. And you, as an immigrant, were brought into the staircase room and told to walk to the top of the staircase where doctors were waiting to examine you. But the truth of it is that there were officials on the stairs watching you. There were people at the top watching you. And if you didn't make it up the staircase without nearly having a heart attack, then they would say you're too unhealthy, don't even bother. So if you make it past the stair test, then they really do give you a physical exam. It was mostly doctors, male doctors back then in the very beginning, and they would look at your eyes, feel around your throat, that kind of stuff. So I do want to tell you that if it had not been for female immigrants complaining that they didn't want a strange man touching them, then we may not have the number of nurses that we have nowadays. This created a real need for females in the medical field, because these female immigrants did not like strange men touching them, and so it created the idea that nurses didn't need to be male, that nurses should actually be female. So much so that today, when you meet a male nurse, it kind of seems odd because nurses are supposed to be female. But that starts because of Ellis Island. All right, so if you pass the physical exam, you're good to go. They would put a letter on you, which indicates things that might be wrong with you if you didn't really pass. And I'll show you a list of those in a minute. But if you pass the stair test, you pass the physical exam, then you have to go and show them that you have at least $5. You show them the $5. You go to the question counter. They ask you why you're here, where are you going to stay. If they don't like your name, that is where they'll change it. And then once you're processed, you go and you wait in the Great Hall, because you can't go through as a family. You go through an individual at a time. And so you go wait in the Great Hall for other family members to come out, and you met each other at the kissing post because they called it that. It really wasn't a kissing post. It was a door entry where people that had just been processed came through, and of course family members would run up and hug and kiss them, and it became known as the kissing post. So if you could make it through all of that, welcome to America. If you didn't, you were going to be put back on the ship, no questions asked, you're gone. So let's look at some of the things that they labeled you with and some of the reasons they might tell you that you can't stay in America. So here we go. And they just did it on, sometimes they would put it on a piece of paper and kind of tack it to your shirt. Other times they would just take a piece of chalk and draw it on your back. And of course, you didn't know what any of these things meant. So an X, suspected mental deficit. An F means your face is too ugly. They don't want you polluting the gene pool in America with your ugliness, so you would be sent back. Eyes, E for eyes, usually meant you had cross-eyed. Pregnancy, maybe they didn't need more babies of your ethnic group in America. So any of these codes right here could mean that you are going to be sent back. Not always, but these are people that were labeled and they were looked at much more closely, and some of them were put back on the boat to be sent home. Now, you know, there were a lot of immigrants coming to America during the Civil War. We talked about this quite a bit, and a lot of them, most of them, were Irish. The next group under them were German. So these people were easier to integrate into American society. Most Germans spoke English. Of course, the Irish spoke English. So they looked like just white people. They didn't look different. They didn't act different. Their religion was similar to ours. So it's not going to be that big of a deal to fit them in to American society. But that changes after 1871. The groups that start coming in after 1871 are labeled the new immigrants. And these guys are not from Northern Europe. They are from Southern and Eastern Europe. These are also the Asian groups. More Asian groups are trying to make their way in. So you have Slavs, you have Greeks. These guys are different. They look different. Their languages are much more difficult. They're very unlikely to speak American or speak American, speak English. I'm a history teacher. I should never have said that, but I hope it gave you a good laugh. But anyway, these are people that don't really fit into society, into American society. And so suddenly we have this huge swell of forced assimilation. Let's make them be like us. And foreign children were required to go to school by law so that they could learn American ways and take them home and teach them to their mom and dad. So American citizens, the children that are American citizens, were not being forced to go to school in the late 1800s, but foreign children were. So that forced assimilation, be like us. It also increased nativism, that idea that if you're a Native American, you are better than people who are not. So let's look at the immigration statistics. 1890s, we had 3.6 million people. By 1901 to 1920, 8.8 million more came in. So you're talking a huge influx of people in 30 years, just huge. So of course you're going to have this rapid influx of people into the cities. That's called urbanization. These buildings have to go up super quick. They're cheap. They're fire traps. They're teeny tiny. The average family lived in a room that was no more than 10 feet by 10 feet. I mean, that's tiny. I have a closet bigger than that. So little teeny tiny rooms, badly built buildings. These are called tenements. And these people ended up living together in groups and developed urban ghettos and ethnic neighborhoods. So I'm going to show you a map here. This is New York City, and you can see that these ethnic groups stuck with people who were like them. So the Italians, I guess, are probably the best example because you have Italians that had multiple neighborhoods, but they are grouped. So look at some of these Guyanese. What the heck's a Guyanese? Haitians. You've got some groups that were okay because they were small enough and friendly enough. They were okay with blending together. So you see the other mixed in there. Look at the Chinese. The Chinese are all over the place too, but they group themselves. And this is still like this today. This is modern New York City. So these groups started kind of claiming their neighborhoods and their ghettos in the late 1800s, and they're still there today. And there's Chicago, same thing. you can see how they different ethnic groups tend to stick together. So these two major cities, Chicago and New York, the two top cities for immigrants from the late 1800s, early 1900s, and they moved in and claimed their neighborhoods, and they're still there today. With these massive numbers of people moving into America, of course, there's going to end up being restrictions placed on how many people can come in. And you already know one, the first immigration act ever based on ethnicity in America was the Chinese Exclusion Act. And remember, that's because they had such a great work ethic that Americans were saying they're making us look bad. We don't want them here anymore. And so the Chinese Exclusion Act is the first one. But by 1921, President Harding, notice I emphasize that. That might mean that's going to be a question on the test. President Harding created the Immigration Restriction Act in 1921, also known as the Emergency Quota Act. So basically, this said we're going to cut down on the number of immigrants. The magical number is 357,000 per year, no more than that. So if you're number 357,001, you can't come in. So only 357,000 per year. And it was also divided by ethnic group. So no ethnic group was allowed to have more than 3% of that 357,000. So it really cut down on how many people could come in from where. And so if you wanted to come to America, you better find that window and jump through it, because it's going to be it's getting tougher and tougher to come to America. So far, we've talked about the immigrants like they were kind of a burden to American society, but they did do wonderful things for America and made us a melting pot. So here's some of the great things they did. Of course, they're going to broaden our minds when it comes to music, religion, colors and clothing. I mean, just untold things, recipes. We were kind of boring and bland. We were like, oh, what do we have? We have salt. And oh, let's wear brown and black and gray. And these different ethnic groups come in and show us what color and spice is all about. So they are also the reason that we became a mighty industrial strength. You needed bodies in those factories when they were new, to build up that wealth base. So let's look at some specific groups that worked in specific fields. And yes, you do need to know this. So the dominating group that worked in textile mills in the Northeast was Irish and German. Make sure you know that. In industry in New York, you're going to have almost all female groups. That goes back to that triangle fire. So New York clothing, not textiles, clothing. So clothing is a specific type of textile. Railroad, of course, you have the Chinese and the Irish, and then the miners in the East were Slavs, Poles, and Italians. Make sure you can tell me where all these people fit into America. The cities themselves are going to change as well. You've got skyscrapers for the very, very first time because you have steel that's suddenly going to allow these buildings to be taller. You're going to have the invention of elevators. So everything that you need to have a taller building is going to be done. Let's just hope that they developed the fire truck that was strong enough to shoot water all the way up to that top floor, right? New types of transportation. We've talked about cable cars and subways. Of course, electricity, with New York being the first city to ever get it. Telephones and business rather than culture in a lot of these cities. So you have business centers for the very first time in cities, and you have cultural centers for the very first time in cities. So this very separate society will develop where you have that business section and those cultural sections, and it's still like that today. When you go to a big city, there's going to be a section of it that's all business, and there's going to be multiple sections that's all culture. So of course you probably talked about this in your World Two class, but the places that these people live, these immigrant people, they did live in some of these taller buildings known as tenements. They were crowded. You could have umpteen people living in that 10 by 10 area. You see how overcrowded it is, how easy it would be to have a fire. See the ceiling, how filthy it is. It's probably something leaked above them. Most of these people are super poor, which means crime rates are going to be really, really high. And just everything about living in a tenement was bad. It was just bad. But here's the thing, for some of these people, a lot of these people, maybe even most of these people, this was a better life than what they left behind. This might be the first time ever that they have running water in the place where they live, where they don't have a communal well that they have to lug buckets of water up and down the staircases. Most of them will not have sewers, but they do have running water. Even if it's not hot, it still is running water. And they have a roof over their head, even if it is water stained from the apartment above you. So to them, this was a better life for many people. Hard to believe. All right, so let's get into the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age is where we're going to have these large business owners taking advantage of those immigrants. So the Gilded Age is considered that time period between 1877 and 1900. And the Gilded Age was a phrase coined by the famous writer Mark Twain. And the Gilded Age is when you have these people who are incredibly rich because of industry and incredibly corrupt. So, absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is when you get extreme laissez faire economics. Laissez faire means hands off to the government. The government is honestly afraid of these massive super rich companies that are being born all over America. And so we suddenly have this very weak federal government. Remember, we're coming out of that President Grant age too, where the political realm was badly scarred because of his the events that took place during his presidency. So that federal government's kind of standing back, letting these industries do what they need to do. And we don't have strong presidents. So the federal government isn't strong. Our presidents aren't strong. But who is strong? I'll tell you who's strong. The political machines in the cities are very, very corrupt. So we're not talking about the president. We're talking about the political entities in these major cities like New York and Chicago. Super corrupt, super powerful, more powerful in many cases than the president or the federal government. They're running like their own little country inside these major cities, and they're the guys in charge, and they are not answering to anyone. So let's take a closer look at that. Now, I use the term political machine. Let's explain that a little bit better here. So, a political machine is at the state and local level, and you have these three different groups working together. You have politicians, you have actual government entities, and business figures working together to basically create whatever laws they want to. So they're going to control the political parties at the local level and at the state level. This is not a giant group of men. This is a very small group of men who become lord and master of the city they live in, and enough that they're controlling state laws and things as well. So they're going to control the political parties. They're going to secure work projects for their allies. And so that sounds complicated, but what it basically means is if you're my friend and you do as I tell you to, I will make sure that you get the next big job coming up, the next sewer system that's got to be built, the next hospital, that kind of thing. So they bought people's friendship. They also provided social services. So if you are a single mom and you need financial help, you could go to your local political machine and ask them for help. And if you had some way of making sure that you and the people in your neighborhood were going to vote for this guy, then you would get help. The most famous of all these political machines took place in New York in a section called Tammany Hall. And that guy, the guy that ran that, was a man by the name of Boss Tweed. Now, he was a commissioner of public works, which meant that he knew all the plans that the city of New York was making for the expansion of these tenements or industry or new roads. He knew all of that in advance, and so he figured out where all these places would go, and he would go buy the land super quick, and then make the state or the city buy it back from him to complete these projects. So super super corrupt guy, constantly bribing people, but he definitely got away with it for a very, very long time. The values of the Gilded Age is very much a mixed bag of voices. So you do have that sense of, for the first time, the self made man, individualism. Boss Tweed was one of those. He was a self made man. Whether he did it legally or not, he did it on his own, pulled himself up by his own bootstraps, that kind of thing. But then you had men like Carnegie saying that if you are a wealthy person, you have the responsibility to help people who are less fortunate. So you have two different voices here. Individualism, I'm all about me, and then the gospel of wealth, but what about everybody else that you should be helping? And then in the mix too, you have social Darwinism. Who's better than who? So what is social Darwinism? In this time period, it would be survival of the richest for the Gilded Age. But social Darwinism really truly is that the rich guys matter and nobody else does. But don't forget, you still have Carnegie there whispering in everybody's ear about the gospel of wealth, and he was not alone. A lot of people felt that way. So, again, just a very mixed bag of voices during the Gilded Age, but they're all extreme. There was a lot of political reform efforts. They're just not going to be more powerful than the political machines. But let's talk about some of them. So, for the first time, America will begin using the secret ballot. It used to be that you just walked up to the voting poll and said your vote out loud. But in Australia, they had been using the secret ballot for a really long time, and we thought that would help with, especially blacks in the South, allow them to vote for who they wanted to vote for. It didn't work because they could still stand at these bad guys could still intimidate you at the polls. At least it was a start, that secret ballot. We also had the Pendleton Civil Service Act created, and this means that you don't just hire people willy nilly. You can't use a spoil system anymore. There was actually an exam to get a government job, and so it depended on that exam result which job you got or if you got one at all. And the reason they did it is because of the assassination of President Garfield. There was a guy by the name of Charles Guiteau who was insane, but he had applied for a government position, did not get it, and so he began stalking the president. And President Garfield was going to go on a summer vacation. So Charles Guiteau found that out because he was stalking the guy, and he met him at the train station and came right up behind President Garfield. Back then, you didn't have any bodyguards, so he was like point blank range, and he shot President Garfield twice. He grazed his shoulder once, and then he shot him in the back. It missed his spinal cord, but it's going to land right behind his pancreas. And so President Garfield is going to be kind of an experiment for doctors. They can't figure out where the one on his shoulder was no big deal. That just grazed him. But they couldn't figure out where the other bullet went, where it actually was. And as a little side note, I need to tell you this. At the train station that day, who was it that escorted President Garfield to the train station but nobody but Robert Lincoln? Remember, I told you that people said that Robert Lincoln was a bad luck charm? This is one of those events. So he was actually there standing right beside President Garfield when he was shot. Robert Lincoln was. And so this is just another thing to add to his reputation as a bad luck charm. But anyway, President Garfield is going to end up living for, I think, 79 days, 79 or 80 days. And in that time, they do horrible things to this guy. They still don't understand that you have to clean your hands before um, do anything invasive on a human body. And so these doctors with dirty hands would dig into the bullet wound with their fingers trying to find the bullet. They even called Alexander Graham Bell and asked him to come up with a metal detector to help them find the bullet. Well, he did. He came up with a metal detector. The problem was the bed that the President Garfield was laying in was also made of metal, and it was screwing things up. And Bell tried to tell the doctors, I need to move him someplace else, and they were like, no, you can't move him. And also, he wanted to do like a scan of Garfield's right side and left side, and they wouldn't let him turn him. So, for whatever reason, they wouldn't let him turn him. So, the side that the bullet actually was laying on never got scanned. And so, Bell's contraption worked, but with the interference from the bed frame and them not actually allowing him to look at the side where the bullet really was laying, they didn't find it. And so this poor president dies in agony. He died of he had poison in his blood, of course. His heart was infected. He had sores all over his body where the sepsis was trying to get out of his body. He actually ends up dying of an aneurysm because, but his whole body was just broken down. So it was a miserable, horrible experience. Now, Charles Guiteau, of course, is taken into custody, which he was fine with. He understood that he was going to get in trouble for this, and he was okay with it. He said he was an instrument of God, and this was meant to happen, and he was going to get famous from it. So he went out and bought a beautiful pearl handled gun because he figured one day it would be in a museum and it would look nice in the museum case. He visited the prison that he figured he would spend some time in, just to check it out. The guy was a nutcase. So when he goes to court, he really truly believes that he can get off on this. He can say that, it was I'm divine right, and I have divine right. God told me to do this. And once he claims insanity, they don't fall for that. Then he actually does medical malpractice. I didn't really kill Garfield. His doctors are inept. They did it. He tried everything and thought that he was going to end up getting off. He actually planned on taking a tour of America to share his experience with the world. He would write a book about it, write some poetry about it, go on tour and lecture, and then end up running for president himself. He really did believe this. So he was shocked when the jury came back and said, "You're guilty and you are going to be sentenced to die." So he is sentenced to hang, but he danced his way up the entire gallows, danced his way. He blew kisses at the audience. He wrote a piece of poetry and demanded that he be allowed to recite it. He wanted a band to actually play music as he was reciting it, and they said, no, no band. You can say the piece of poetry, but no band. So the guy truly was a lunatic. Even in the courtroom, he was passing notes to other people in the courtroom, asking for advice. He would get up and scream at his own lawyers and just make fun of them. He was a nutcase. But anyway, in the end, Garfield ends up dying. Charles Guiteau ends up being hung for it, and so out of that entire horrible event, we get the Pendleton Civil Service Act, where no more spoil system. You have to take the test and do well on the exam in order to get a government job. Now, mixed up in this, we have mugwumps. And mugwumps were liberal Republicans who thought that the Republican Party had become corrupt. And so they are the ones that are going to start pushing the federal government to make a lot of reforms. They're completely against the machine, that political machine, and they end up becoming a very loud voice. So because they are now, they're Republicans, but they think the Republican Party is broken. And so they are going to actually cheer on a Democrat to become president for the first time since the Civil War, and that will be Grover Cleveland. So the mugwumps are also asking for reform, and their version of reform is getting a Democrat into the House for a while. Wonder what Trump would say about all that today. Let's talk about Black America during the Gilded Age. This is the last thing we're going to talk about. You already know about the Jim Crow laws and the idea that black men especially are being hung or burned for basically no reason at all, just suspicion of something. You could be hung or burned for that. We also have a Plessy versus Ferguson case that goes to the Supreme Court in 1896. Homer Plessy was on a railroad car, and he sat in the white section and got into a whole lot of trouble for it, and so he sues the railroad company and loses. And out of Homer Plessy, we get that separate but equal mentality that blacks and whites are legally to be separated forever and ever until 1954. That's the way the world's going to be here in America. So it's separate but equal. It is never going to be equal. Never going to be equal. Definitely separate, but never equal. Many black Americans will be disenfranchised through tricky things like a poll tax. You have to pay all this money to go vote. Of course, people aren't going to. And literacy test. Literacy test was a big thing during the time period, but it wasn't a here, take this and read it, Jack and Jill went up the hill kind of thing. It was very, very complicated math equations that didn't make any sense whatsoever. Super hard literary passages, just ridiculous type of testing. There also is going to be this huge, giant wave of violence in the form of lynchings. And the lady that's going to come to the rescue is a woman by the name of Ida B. Wells. Now, Ida B. Wells was a writer, and she was this teeny tiny, like 5'1" fireball. And she had a couple good friends who were some business owners. They owned a grocery, in fact, and they were doing really, really well. They were black individuals, three black men, and they were doing really, really well. And she had a newspaper, and she actually wrote about them a couple times, how well that they were doing. Well, there was a white grocer in the town that didn't like it, that the black grocer was getting more business, and so he burned their business to the ground. And Ida B. Wells wrote about it. These men were actually killed as well. The grocers were all killed. And so she wrote about that. And she was not afraid to name names. She put in her newspaper exactly who did what to who. And the white community went ballistic. They burned down her newspaper. She didn't care. She just wrote it from her house after that. She also, again, still was not afraid to name names. She also went to DC quite often. And at one point, she was 9 months pregnant with one of her children. You can see all the beautiful little kids here. I love the little girl in the middle. She looks so sassy. But she was pregnant with one of her kids, due to have it any day. And she got on a train, and it was overfilled train, and where in the black car you were all kind of smushed together. So there was a smoking car for the whites where only smokers sat in it, but in the black section it was it was mixed, and she was pregnant, and the smoke was making her sick. So she decides that she's going to get up and move to another section. She's pregnant. The smoke is making her sick. So she moves to another section. It ends up being the white section, and she is going to be thrown from the train. It took six conductors to get this teeny tiny, very pregnant woman off the train. She sued, and she won. So Ida B. Wells was a force to be reckoned with. She ends up cutting the number of hangings at least by half once her newspaper becomes very, very public. People are afraid of being named in it, and so they stop that lynching. She also writes quite a bit about using the rape myth as an excuse to hang or burn black men. That was the number one thing that was used to hurt black men during the time. They would claim that they raped a white woman, and immediately, the whole town was ready to hang or burn this guy. And it was a myth. It could be something as simple as, he looked in a white woman's direction, and by the end of the day he had raped her. And so Ida says, this is not what's happening. The truth of it is, this is just an excuse to take a human life. And so, again, she uses her newspaper for that. So, Ida, we'll talk more about in another unit. I just wanted to introduce you to Ida, because she does come about in the Gilded Age. And like I said, she's a force to be reckoned with. All right, so that is the end of this very, very, very long unit. I hope you have not waited all these days before you started studying, because it is a lot of information. But okay, if you haven't studied, get on it.